Hi there, it's Marla at Narrate. This week's message begins a 4-week series called Relationship Charades. Adam begins the conversation by discussing desires and expectations. What happens when our desires become expectations, and how does this affect our relationships? Enjoy the message.
So I want to jump into this series, and I have a few kind of preliminary thoughts. The first one is, there's a way of doing relationship and a way of doing communication that's real and authentic and yet full of imperfection. And then there's a way of doing relationship and a way of doing communication that's all kinds of manipulative and indirect and hints at and believes that real love is translating things that aren't actually said. And that tension is really what I want to drill down on. We're not... to talk about relationships and marriage, it's a very broad topic, and what I want to do is drill down real specifically on just a couple dynamics that I think all of us will relate to in some form or fashion, and then next time we do a marriage series, we'll find another very specific thing. If you're a guest with us, it would be important to me that you would know that we do all kinds of series around here. We do theology series, which we're going to jump into one on Easter called Cruciform. We do kind of more indirect book studies from the text. We do character studies from the text. We do leadership series. We do vision series, kind of vision of local church. We do culture series. And then periodically we do these relationship series, sometimes marriage, sometimes parenting, sometimes just friendship in general, though I think all of them, there's all kinds of application that crosses those lines. And the thing that I feel pretty insecure about, the type of series that I have the most trepidation about is our relationship series, excuse me. Because, listen, I genuinely think you have to decide whether or not I genuinely believe it, but the way I genuinely feel is the difference between me and you as we try to be the church together is that my day job allows me to spend days and weeks and months, sometimes even years, studying stuff and looking out on the broad horizon of ideas and observations from the text that we can then bring to the floor that I think are helpful. And I say that because The danger of a relationship series is that, especially with the stage this elevated, is that I would give off some persona that I've got something figured out and you're a bunch of peons, and if you just follow my lead in marriage, then we'd all have perfect marriages, and nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, one of my real dangers and insecurities is the reality that my wife and kids come to Narrate. And so when we talk about parenting, we talk about marriage, there's that sense of like, you're a hypocrite. You don't do any of that stuff. And that's exactly the point. Like, we're learning this stuff together. So I just kind of want to say that this is not, because I realize that sometimes relationship series, sometimes we'd rather talk about money, right? Especially sometimes us dudes. Like, you don't work on the car till the car breaks. You don't talk about the relationship until it breaks. So it gets uncomfortable. And I just want to say, like, I'm with you in all of this. And what we're going to do for a few weeks is drill down on some, I think, pretty specific dynamics. These are the series where I'm most prone to plagiarize. Again, because I don't think of myself as an expert here, and it's pretty scary to talk definitively, and so these are the series where I'm most prone to be constantly grabbing after other series and other books going like, what are the ideas out there that people are making from the text? I mean, the text is, of course, hugely helpful, but the way we talk about the text determines whether or not we actually hear it or we fall asleep when we're talking about it. And so I'm constantly kind of looking for ideas from other people on relationship series, and in this one, to be just perfectly honest with you, I'm hugely indebted to Andy Stanley for a couple series he did. Years and years and years ago, he did a series called I Marriage. And we actually plagiarized that back in 2010 and did a series called Robotic Love. More recently, he's done, from best I can tell, he plagiarized himself and redid a lot of the content in that in a series called What Happy Couples Know. And again, what I'm doing is kind of taking many of his ideas from those two series and trying to incorporate them into our life in Helena in 2018. I was walking to work on Tuesday, because Monday's my day off, and so Tuesday morning at about 8 a.m. is maybe my clearest point of my life many times, especially after getting to be gone for the weekend, and thank you for that, by the way. The video thing I know is a little weird. It's not lost on me that like we're used to going to school, and when the teacher says we're going to watch a video, that's akin of we're going to punt today. I hope what you understand is there's guys like Vern reaching back into last week. If you weren't with me, I'm sorry. Maybe I shouldn't even brought this up. But I hope what you understand is there are people out there, Vern being one of them, the person who helped plant this church or made planting this church possible, who we can't get here. And frankly, well, we can, and we've had him here before, but it comes with a caveat, because when I say, hey, Vern, do you want to come to Narrate and teach? He says, sure, and then you'll come to Harvest. which is a net zero gain for me, quite frankly, because then I got to go there and teach Saturday and Sunday, and it's not that it's not an honor, it's just that it doesn't actually accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish, and so this video thing is a way of trying to do that. So thanks for your trust. I heard from many of you. I was mad when I heard it was a video, and then when I saw the content, I was very grateful for it. So for whatever it's worth, thanks for trusting us enough to do that. So I was walking to work on Tuesday with a somewhat clear mind because, again, I got to be gone, and it was Tuesday. And I had this moment where I was like, man, I wish, like, the Jews have bar mitzvah. Like, I wish when I was 13 years old, somebody would have sat me down and went, Adam, here's the deal. For the rest of your life, your epic struggle will be over this particular tension. Or if not at 13, I wish somebody, when I got my driver's license, when I graduated high school, someone would have sat me down and would have said, Adam, for the rest of your life, like, you're Voldemort, if you will. Like that thing that you will face off against for the rest of your life. Or maybe when I got married, maybe when we had our first child, maybe when we moved to Helena to get to plant a church, I wish somebody would have sat down and went, Adam, like the Vader in your life. He won't always sound like Darth, but it's the same concept. The villain in your life will be this tension between desires and expectations. Because you can't really live without desires, but the moment desires become expectations, you become a monster. I think another way you could talk about this is just being a control freak. Like, I wish somebody would have sat me down and went, Adam, the struggle that you will deal with, and by the way, I'm not trying to criticize my parents or Vern or anybody else who influenced me. I'm not actually thinking that would be all that realistic, nor am I operating under the assumption that I would have actually listened if they would have told me that. But nonetheless, I wish somebody, what I feel like I'm finally starting to realize is there's no getting away from the tension between desires and expectation. That any attempt to study God, it can go sideways, and it's not an attempt to know God, it's an attempt to control God. That any attempt to learn about relationships, if it goes sideways, isn't an attempt to be better at relationship, it's to eliminate vulnerability from relationship. And I think what we would call a struggle with control is a struggle between desires and expectations. And then there's prayers like the Serenity Prayer. You may have heard of this. Serenity Prayer, I just did some quick Wikipedia research on it this week, which is always useful and accurate, I know. Actually, I think crowdsourcing would argue it actually is very useful and accurate, but we could argue about that later. The Serenity Prayer was written in 1934 by a pastor from Massachusetts. And just the timelessness of it helps me understand that my struggle is not unique to me or to us. Well, listen to what he penned, again, almost 100 years ago. Go ahead to that, will you? He says, God, this is the Serenity Prayer, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Like, you'd almost never have to learn another new thing for the rest of your life if you could just apply that, wouldn't you say? And yet, in some sense, as much as I know there's this epic struggle that I will deal with for the rest of my life between desires and expectations, it helps me to know that this isn't unique to us, this isn't unique to me. Like, this is a human struggle. And this point, it reminded me very quickly of James chapter 4. And again, what James does for me is that the timelessness of his words just reassures me that God is behind the text and is gifting us something in 2018. Listen to this. What causes fights and quarrels among you? To which we go like, wait a minute, who's reading my mail? How did you know? Like, how did you know that my life is an endless stream of conflicts, if not external and relational, internal and emotional? How did you know that just describes my entire existence? And he doesn't even answer the question. Listen, he keeps going. Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? It's like James is going, you want to know why you're always mad? You want to know why you're always sideways? You want to know why you're always anxious? You want to know why you're always ticked off at somebody? You want to know why there seems to never be peace? It's because you want stuff. Which I think one of the follow-up questions we have to ask is, so is James saying do not desire? And I'm going to argue he couldn't possibly be saying that unless it's the only two verses in the Bible, because the Bible is full of precedent. In fact, go to the opening act of the Bible, and you have a God who has a wide open white canvas. He creates people in his image. This God spends a series of time doing lots of very dynamic, creative stuff. Then he creates people in his image, and it's like he leaves them in a room full of an endless supply of Legos and goes, let's just see what you do. It reminds me of Augustine way, way back when he said, just love God and do what you please, which is dangerous to a fundamentalist mindset, but it's a reminder that desires are part of who God is. To desire is part of what it means to be made in God's image, which is not to say that all desires are given that actually glorify God or in any way add value to the lives of others, but that desiring couldn't possibly be the problem. So what's the problem? Well, desires create attention, don't they? I think the Olympics draw this out very, very well. And on one hand, I'm glad they're over. And on the other hand, that was fun. I would advocate that they should rename the Olympics figure skating. It's really, and I had planned to say that all week until last night happened, and JR and I flipped on the Olympics. So I don't know what your pattern has been. Like our family kind of 7:30 or so, flip them on, watch for an hour or so, go to bed, watch figure skating, right? Like all the while there's people flying down hills and going 85 miles an hour in these fiberglass vessels, and you're just watching figure skating. Which is not to say there's not athleticism involved, but it is to say like it's a bit lopsided. And my case was even made all the more last night because like figure skating's over. Like the dogs have figure skated, the couples have figure skated, the women have figure skated, the men had figure skated. And last night when you turn on the Olympics at 7:30, what was on? Figure skating. They weren't even competing for medals. They were just skating, and it was what was on TV. So I rest my case on that. But anyway, I do think there's something about the figure skating thing that we can capture here, because maybe it's because of the proximity that you can get to the athlete's face. You could watch this whole desire, expectation, heart-wrenching, why do desires create so much pain in our life? You could watch it play itself out over and over again, because there's some young athlete, male, female, couple, whatever, who've spent at least the last 4 years giving their every waking second to this very moment. And they've made that turn or they've made that jump a jillion times, and they slip and fall this time, and you can watch. And part of what I just couldn't help but respect is to watch after one of those athletes fell and hit the ice, they knew their dreams were dashed and gone, and yet they had to suck it up and finish their routine. In fact, at the risk of admitting that I watched the female final on Thursday night, if you did watch it, there's a lot there. Here's this 18-year-old girl who's won everything for the last several years, and now this up-and-comer kind of rises to the scene, and I couldn't pronounce her name because I don't have a PhD in Russian, because, man, those are some hard names to pronounce. But if you watched that 18-year-old who ultimately got silver, but she got a silver after skating an almost perfect routine. And she immediately got emotional when she was done, and then they showed her in the scorer's booth thingamajig that they do. And she found out she lost by 1.5 points, and she kind of kept it together and kind of got emotional, and you could see the looks on her face. And the announcers at one point, I forget which one, caught her saying to her coach, "I did everything I could to win gold." And it wasn't enough. And for some of you, this describes the angst that you feel with desire, because it makes you vulnerable. Like the struggle in your life that's born of your desires, whether it's for a relationship or a certain career, or whether it's for your health, whatever it is, it's essential, but it makes you vulnerable to heartbreak, doesn't it? Because the reality is, just because you desire it and you give 4 years, if not your entire existence to it, doesn't necessarily mean that you control the outcome of it, which is what can cause this pendulum to swing in such rapid succession from one extreme to the other. Because what can happen, and maybe some of you were here, you had big desires, say for a relationship or a job or a friendship or a career, and you got your heart broke. It didn't work, and so what happens? You just quit. And if it's not a clinical level of depression, hopefully at some point you can go like, this isn't healthy either. See, what James is speaking to here is this desire thing, and by the way, I really don't, we're not going to look much at the text this morning, because I think these two verses leave us a lot to think about. That what James is pointing out is what you and I experience in marriage, sure, in life in general. That it's like we can't not desire, but desiring makes us vulnerable, because a healthy person bears in mind that they can't control outcomes, not completely. And there's a tension, because when desires become expectations, we become monsters. This is where I think marriage can help, and this is where I think Andy Stanley did some brilliant stuff that we can grab hold of to kind of illustrate all this, because, by the way, these aren't baseballs, though I wish they were, because that would be fun. But the reality is that all of us, we enter into a relationship, we enter into life, we enter into college, everything we do, a job, we enter into it with a certain set of desires. You might call them hopes or dreams, right? Like when you got married, you had desires about this stuff, right? You had desires about your money. And maybe your desires weren't fully clear until you were married, or maybe they weren't fully clear for the first couple of years of marriage, but what you quickly realize is, like, you have desires for your money. Like, you were going to be a family with one income because one of you was going to work and the other was going to stay home, or you were going to be a family with two incomes, but the thing was is you were going to save the entire other income because you're German and you like financial security, or you were going to live on both incomes and you were going to raise your standard of living. And then there's desires that it relates to savings. Like some of you, you just can't put enough in IRAs and save for retirement. And others of you, you have desires like, why would I save for that? I don't even know if I'll be alive then. Let's just enjoy it now. We have desires for our giving. Like, how much are we going to give? This is cliche as it comes, but the number one destroyer of marriages is this stuff. Why? Because when we enter into a marriage, we have desires for this stuff. And that's okay. So we have desires for money. We have desires for travel. Right? Like, because some of you want to travel the world, and not like the world where you can drink the water, but the world where the water might kill you. Like, you want to go to the third world. You would love to hang out in Africa for extended time, and others of you are like, I don't need to go to the third world. I want to go to London. They speak English, but it's across the pond. And others of you are like, I don't need to leave the country. It's a plenty large enough country. And some of you are like, Montana is big. and then there's others, and I've met some of you. You're like, Helena's a great place. Right, so we have these desires for travel. We have desires for what we're going to drive. I took this from my boys. But this tension comes up, like, because you're going to drive a sports car. And your wife's going like, we have 4 kids. And you're like, so, well, you can drive that 1976 station wagon. I'm going to drive a sports car. We have desires for what we're going to drive. Are you going to drive high mileage stuff or new stuff? Are you going to lease stuff? Are you going to trade it in every few years because you work hard and you want to drive nice cars? Or others of you are like, I don't like cars that much. I'm just going to drive stuff till the wheels fall off. Some of you want to budget for your cars. Others of you, like, budgeting, it sounds like allowance, and you work too hard to have an allowance, so you don't want anything to do with that. We have desires for where we're going to live, right? Like, are you going to live in an apartment, in a condo? Are you going to buy, or are you going to own? And even if you decide whether you're going to rent or buy, if you decide you're going to buy, then there's these whole conversations of like, so are you going to build? And where are you going to build? Or are you going to buy a fixer-upper? Or are you going to buy something in between? And then there's this, you have desires like, what you want to do is you want to live in the same house for the rest of your life. Or others of you are like, no, we're going to flip. Like, we're going to flip houses because we're going to upgrade houses over the course of our lives. And then there's this whole conversation, like, you have desires for who's going to do the chores, right? Because we all have different desires about the definition of a clean house, right? And that's one of the first things we figure out in marriage is like, what exactly does it mean to wash the toothpaste down the sink? And at what point has that been done successfully? We have desires about who's going to clean the house and when it's going to get done and how often it's going to get dusted, if it's ever going to get dusted. I mean, is dusting just opening the windows and letting the wind blow through the house? Then there's desires about trim and lawn. We have desires about where we're going to live. We have desires about our calendar, which the best I could do is the school calendar because this is the only one I actually have in my existence in my office. But, I mean, there's this thing called Christmas and Thanksgiving, and you have desires about how you're going to celebrate the holidays. Ever thought about that? Like your family gets Christmas, Thanksgiving, and Easter, and her family gets, I don't know, like President's Day and something else. There's desires about the holidays, how we're going to do that. There's desires about our time. Especially like our time as it relates to, is that not the coolest clock ever? Old school, which is why it doesn't get used at my house. But we have desires for our time, especially our discretionary time. Like, do her friends become your friends, or do your friends become her friends, or do you have separate friends? Like, do you do stuff separately, or do you only do stuff together? You have desires for your recreation. I mean, is it traditional sports? I'm a fan of baseball. Is it non-traditional sports? I mean, is your recreation, some of you, your desire for recreation is Target and Macy's. And others is like snowshoes on Mount Helena. We have desires as it relates to that. We have desires for conflict resolution. Like, do you get to leave? Some of you are like, no, I get to leave when we have conflict. And others are like, no, we get to yell. And others are like, you can't yell. Like, that's disrespectful. And others of you like, you get it all out. You get everything out. And others of you, your desire is like, you just make sure that what you get out is actually accurate and truthful. You guys, you would never admit this, but you have desires for what your wife will or won't wear to bed, right? If we're being honest. And others of you are like, I just want to be comfortable. We have desires as it relates to all kinds of sexual things, all kinds of recreational things. We have desires. There's this one. We've stepped into this one. Some of you have desires about your pets. like whether or not you'll ever have one. And whose job is it to pick up the dog poop? And what kind of dog will we have, and how will we train them? What else? What other desires do we have? We have desires about how we're going to treat one another. Like is opening the door a mandate, or is that chauvinistic? Like, see, the reality is, and really what I think James is getting at here is that if we can become emotionally aware of the fact that when we enter into a relationship, we bring with us a bucket of desires. And that would work all the better if only one of us did. But the reality is we both enter into the relationship. And this, if you're not married, this applies to teams, this applies to work, this applies to anything. We are constantly bumping into other people who also have desires while we ourselves have our own desires. And there's an important but obvious question to ask, and I think is like, where do they come from? And I think the reality is they come from what we read, what we watch on TV, what we experience. Most of us, if not all of us, our desires are either a reaction to something we experienced or a desire to recreate something we experienced. But the reality is we enter into relationships with buckets full of desires. So why do our desires get us in trouble? James is there to help. Watch what he does in verse 2. You desire, but you do not have, so you kill. Now, commentators debate. Some think that he's speaking literally. Some think he's using euphemism of some sort, exaggerating in some sense. But I don't think it matters. His point stands. That something happens if we're not careful. We have a desire that grows its own kind of legs and becomes its own kind of animal. And if our desires become expectations, then we can suddenly justify all kinds of behavior to make it happen. I think those who work in the field would probably be quick to tell us, I've heard this said, that in many cases, the people in our prisons aren't as different from us as we might think. That what happens is when desires grow legs and become expectations, suddenly we can justify cheating on our taxes. Suddenly we can justify all kinds of behaviors. Suddenly we act out of character because why? Because we have an expectation and we are furious that it's not being met. And this, I think, is the dangerous part about desires and expectations. And I think James is hinting at the emotion of this. That the trouble is there's an imaginary line where a desire becomes an expectation, but it's not always clearly marked. Like we move from here to here, and nobody tells us we just crossed from desire to expectation. But when we do, watch out. Things get dangerous. And James is going, listen, again, I don't think he could possibly be saying, don't desire. To be human is to desire. God did not intend to make robots. He meant to make image bearers, empowered people who make decisions and act creatively. And yet James is going, be careful. Because when a desire becomes an expectation, oh, buddy, watch out. He continues, you covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. Again, he's observing this dynamic. My friend Fred used to say to me, and when I was younger, I just didn't understand it. It seemed like such a nonsensical statement, but in my formative years, he was constantly saying, Adam, high hopes, low expectations. High hopes, low expectations. And that always seemed like a giant contradiction of terms to me, but I think I'm finally starting to understand what he's saying there as I'm walking to work on Tuesday going like, I wish somebody would have told me when I was 13 years old. There is a massive tension between desires and expectations, and while it's a subtle little difference, that difference makes all the difference in the world and the way we relate to things. So when do our desires get us in trouble? I think Judas displays this for us. You know, Judas, the New Testament character who was so trusted by Jesus, it would seem that he became the treasurer of the movement, who ultimately handed him over to be arrested. And there's considerable scholarship out there that argues that when Judas handed Jesus over to be arrested, he was trying to push Jesus' buttons. He wasn't betraying Jesus so much as he was going, listen, you're here to set up a messianic kingdom. Do it. Stop playing around. No more charades. Like, let's make this thing happen. And so the assumption was, I'll turn him over to the authorities, and then Jesus will step into the phone booth, and he'll step out Superman, and boom, we'll get this party started. What is that? It's Judas with a desire. And it would seem that in those days and weeks, hours before the betrayal, Jesus seemed to understand that it was going on, but the desire became an expectation. And without being fully aware of how that was affecting him, Judas started to do some wild things. And I think Jesus models it from the positive. If Jesus was as human as we celebrate him as being, then his moment in the garden was full of all kinds of vulnerability. As on the one hand, he understood the need to take on darkness and sin and evil. On the other hand, it wasn't lost on him how brutal it would be. And he had those moments in the garden. Lord, I would desire, God, he's saying, that we find another way. Like, could we just send out a mailer? And yet he allows, but I'm not going to let this desire become an expectation. I'm still surrendered to that. When do desires become dangerous? It seems, first of all, when desires become expectations, we're in some trouble. And if we don't notice that's what's going on, that's when we leave. And that's not to suggest that there's never, please don't read into that comment as it relates to divorce, but that's when we quit. That's when we can act out in all kinds of other ways and justify it. Why? Because we had an expectation and it's going unmet. The other thing I think that this has stood out to me, and certainly you in your own thinking and musing and studying of this, I'm sure will add to it, but is that desires, they get dangerous by definition when they stay subconscious. Like, that's the danger. Like, when we have desires and we don't even know what they are, and this is the charade part, right? Because sometimes we don't know what they are, but we expect her to. Or sometimes we do know what they are, but it seems disingenuous to actually tell her, because it wouldn't actually be love if you did it in response to a desire I have. Like, the whole game is you're supposed to figure it out. So we play this charade, and I kind of indirectly tell you, and you demonstrate your love for me by actually reading my mind and figuring out what I desire without my actually telling you. Right? I mean, I don't mean to tread on any kind of personal stuff, but desires, I think, become really, really dangerous when they become when we don't communicate them. And the tricky thing is the target's constantly moving, right? And this is where I get into the human side of this. Like, this is not me, bony finger. This is like this. I think James is empathizing with us, because part of what makes this so darn hard is the desires you had when you first got married are different now that you've got teenagers in the house. And they're different now that your youngest is about to graduate high school. And they're different. Fill in the blank. So what do we do with all this? Well, there's a couple of things that have stood out to me. And again, I'm not an expert, but I'm trying to work hard on this and begging God's Spirit to help me work hard on this. The first thing is, it seems to me that when we catch ourselves having those emotional responses that we would say are out of character, James is telling us all the lights on the dashboard should be going off, telling us, wait a minute, be careful. You had a desire that's become an expectation, and that's what's driving this response. I think a lot of my own struggles with anxiety are a misunderstanding of the health of having the desire of, fill in the blank, being safe. But I can't expect that. And when I expect that, then all kinds of negative emotion comes with it. The other thing, this is to whatever degree you care to do it, here's my challenge to you this week is, it seems to me that, and we could apply this in an overwhelming number of areas of life, but let's just start with one. You pick it. If you're married, I'm going to challenge you to pick that one. It seems that we do well to just take the time to understand what are our desires. Like, to name them. And that's not to be so naive as to think you're going to name all of them, nor is it so naive to think that you're going to come up with a canonized list and it's never going to change. But maybe there's wisdom in creating space, slowing down, if you will, and going, well, wait a minute, so what are my desires? And then you can decide what to do with them, and we're going to actually talk. That's really where we're going the next couple of weeks. Like, okay, so what are we supposed to do with these things called desires? If we're not supposed to stuff them, we're not supposed to hide them, if in fact they do honor God, then what does a healthy person do with these? And I think James can help us here as well as other places in the text. But what's in your bucket seems to be a really good place to start. And let me just end on this. I think, we exist the way we do in so many ways because what we want to do is make Jesus approachable for those of you who long ago came to misunderstandings about him. And I think this one could be the most gravest of all the misunderstandings, that that we understand this God who is this tyrannical judge who has all these expectations, and if we don't do the dirge the way he tells us to do the dirge, then we're done. Not the Jesus that I'm going to argue you meet if you actually open the text and read the Gospels. That what you see is a God who has desires for you and isn't going to apologize for that, and creates lots and lots of space for you to choose how you're going to respond to his desires. And sometimes we so overcomplicate this whole, like, what does it mean to have a relationship with God, getting saved, born again, all those things. I'm going to argue it's this genuine conviction that the God of the universe is good and can be trusted, that he's been deeply committed to your relationship for longer than you even knew you needed it, that he's paid steep, heavy prices for it, and that he invites us to step into and learn his desires and live within them and trust him. And to do so doesn't require any kind of outward gesture, though that wouldn't necessarily hurt. It just requires an acknowledgement to God, like, Lord, this is, I want this, and I'm going to step forward in this. Let me pray. Jesus, thanks, Lord, that you made us people with lots and lots and lots and lots of creativity and options and freedom. And God, thanks that you also are a God of desires for us and that your desires can be trusted. And whether we're wrestling from the relationship side with you or the relationship side with someone we love, whether at work or in our home, would you give us the courage to work through some of this, the wisdom to understand what to do with it, the courage to act on it. We love you. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.